to remind you what you've been hearing about all week, which is why abolitionism and women's rights became linked for so many reformers. As male and female reformers worked together to end slavery in the decades before the Civil War, they often spoke of their goal of universal suffrage. Now, just as a reminder, what does it mean to say universal suffrage?
All males should vote, can vote.
What is, no, universal.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Universal means everyone, male, female, black, and white. That's what those radical reformers thought. This isn't talking about, the average American, right? But in the reform community, the people who were abolitionists believed that all adults should gain the right to vote and be full citizens. And because radical anti-slavery activists led by William Lloyd Garrison and others were so sympathetic to this idea of universal suffrage, black and white women who wanted the right to vote before the Civil War did not feel a need for a separate organization dedicated only to women's rights. So they did have women's rights conventions, but they were made up of pretty much the same people, who went to the anti-slavery conventions, and they were active in both groups, right? And not only that, but at the start of the Civil War, they also believed that the Republican Party and the president, Abraham Lincoln, would support both the emancipation of the slaves and universal suffrage. So that's how they were going into that. With the start of the war, Northern women, black and white, put their own fight for equal rights on hold, though. For example, the 1861 Women's Rights Convention was canceled. And they wanted to spend and emphasize time and effort in their loyalty to the Union. So Northern women's rights activists engaged in war work as volunteer nurses, as war relief workers, and they also, of course, continued, but actually even ramped up, their campaign to abolish slavery. In 1863, women's rights activists and female abolitionists led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton formed a group that they called the Women's National Loyal League. And you can hear from the title, what the idea was. They're emphasizing that they're organizing as women, but it's national as in the union, the nation, and they're loyal to that union. But what they did with this is the Women's National Loyal League organized a massive petition drive in favor of a constitutional amendment to permanently end slavery everywhere in the United States, as opposed to just in occupied territories, etc. So by 1865, this group, the National Women's Loyal League, or Women's National Loyal League, had actually managed to send 265,000 signatures in favor of a constitutional amendment to Congress, which then did pass the 13th Amendment, right? So, let's see. The 13th Amendment is up here, and it's the first of what we call the Reconstruction era amendments, or the Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th. It's pretty simple, and it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment of a crime, right? Because that's what being in prison is. Whereas, if you've been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States or any place subject to its jurisdiction. And then this is crucial. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Okay? This is a really important piece to this puzzle because it's an assertion of federal authority and giving Congress to enforce the Constitution. This is an important point for Congress to make in the period right after a war of rebellion from the Union, right? They want to make sure that they're getting their point across. So this is what women were doing, and how they've been spending their time, these activist women, during the Civil War. And now I'd like to view this debate over women's suffrage and the Reconstruction Amendments through the eyes of a free black woman, here she is, Frances Watkins Harper, who had been born in Maryland, became an abolitionist and a poet, and wrote kind of anti-slavery reform poetry and Christian poetry, temperance poetry, things like that. But in any case, so she was an anti-slavery activist, a women's rights person, but mainly thought of herself as an abolitionist. And her primary focus had been on improving the plight of all Black Americans, regardless of their sex. But her epiphany regarding the need for Black and white women to organize together for women's rights, as well as for the abolition of slavery, came when she was widowed in Ohio in 1864 during the Civil War. She had been mostly active on the East Coast as an activist, but she had moved and married and moved into Ohio. But when her husband died in 1864, she recognized the fundamental legal discrimination faced by all married women at the time. It's called coverture, and the idea is that when you're married, you're literally covered in the eyes of the law. You're invisible in the eyes of the law by your husband, right? So that you don't have a separate legal identity. Your identity is your husband's identity. And so when she goes to this conference after the war, that's a women's rights conference, she describes her realization of the need to fight for women's rights specifically. And she says, "My husband had died suddenly, leaving me a widow with 4 children, one my own and the other stepchildren. I tried to keep my children together, but my husband died in debt, and before he had been in his grave 3 months, the administrator had swept the very milk crocks and wash tubs from my hands. I was a farmer's wife and made butter for the Columbus market, but what could I do when they had swept all away? Had I died instead of my husband, how different would have been the result. By this time, he would have had another wife, it is likely, and no administrator would have gone into his house, broken up his home, and sold his bed and taken away his means of support. I say then that justice is not fulfilled so long as woman is unequal before the law." In fact, Harper's savings from royalties from her books of poetry and lecture fees had paid for the farm. But this investment was legally her husband's, not hers. All right? So this traumatic event proved to her that as a married woman, and then it turns out as a widow, she was powerless before the law. She was forced to leave her stepchildren with her husband's relatives, and she took her daughter and resumed her public speaking and writing as a way to support them both. And thus, I think what you can see is that a growing awareness of women's legal subordination and dependency in marriage led Harper into women's rights activism after the Civil War. And in this very powerful speech that she gave at the National Women's Rights Convention, which was held in New York City in 1866, she explains more about her position. And this is an address that she was giving at a conference which actually led to the formation of something called the American Equal Rights Association. There's no need to have an anti-slavery association anymore, obviously. They have to get a new name. And they don't want to disband because there's more to work on. So they decide at this women's rights convention to create a new organization for all these reformers, and they decide to call themselves the American Equal Rights Association. All right? And she's interested in this and wants to recognize the fact that, as Susan B. Anthony was the one who actually suggested creating this organization, by the way, but wanted to recognize the fact that Black women, Black men, and white women were all seeking equal rights, universal suffrage, and what they called a human rights platform, right, based on this concept of full citizenship for everybody. So from the start, some of the former anti-slavery activists, including prominent men like Wendell Phillips, opposed introducing what they thought of as the new and controversial idea of women's suffrage, and they did not want the constitutional debates over the 14th Amendment to get muddied by the concept of women's suffrage. But a variety of other Black and white abolitionists supported the move to universal suffrage, and Harper joined the new Equal Rights Association because it included universal suffrage as its goal. At this first meeting of the Women's Rights Association in 1866, which led to the American Equal Rights Association. Harper gave this powerful speech. I already quoted from part of it. But she also began by noting her status as an outsider at this mostly white and mostly women convention, white women convention. She explained, "I feel I am something of a novice upon this platform, born of a race whose inheritance has been outrage and wrong. Most of my life has been spent in battling against those wrongs, but I did not feel as keenly as others that I had those rights in common with other women, which are now demanded." Her sudden widowhood, as we've seen, changed her understanding of the need for women's legal equality. But drawing on her positive experiences of working in the interracial abolitionist movement, Harper favored interracial collaboration. And she believed that it should be based on a notion of women's and people's fundamental and common humanity. Strategically, she also believed that white and black women's collective power and protest would be more impressive to white politicians if they worked together than if they had separate organizations. So she committed herself to working with white women, but only if they were willing to work with black women on an equal footing. So she accused white women reformers of being directly complicit in the oppression of blacks. She challenged them to take responsibility for the unequal position of blacks in America and to start by ridding themselves of their own prejudices. So she says, "We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse on its own souls. You tried that in the case of the Negro. You pressed him down for 2 centuries, and in doing so, you crippled the moral strength and paralyzed the spiritual energies of the white men of the country." And by that, she actually means all white people. "When the hands of the black were fettered, white men were deprived of the liberty of speech and the freedom of the press." Oppression denigrates the oppressors as well as the oppressed, Harper noted. She also reminded her audiences that the antebellum gag rule that Congress had passed had banned the anti-slavery petitions and had limited all reformers' freedom of speech and First Amendment rights to protest. So she was basically trying to say everybody was damaged by what had happened. And white women were as guilty as white men in perpetuating prejudice and hate, she insisted. She rejected the idealized notion of womanhood that was so prevalent in the dominant culture at the time, this kind of the cult of true womanhood, etc. Speaking with honesty and some apt sarcasm, Harper explained to this predominantly white audience that, quote, "I do not believe that giving women the ballot is going to immediately end all the ills of life. I do not believe that white women are dewdrops just exhaled from the sky. I think that they, like men, may be divided into 3 classes: the good, the bad, and the indifferent. The good would vote according to their convictions and principles, the bad as dictated by prejudice or malice, and the indifferent will vote on the strongest side of the question with the winning party." So, wary of white women's claims of purity, claims that were implicitly based on black women's contrasting impurity, Harper insisted that white women were fallible and certainly not pure dewdrops. So, to further highlight for her audience the discrepancies between her experience as a black woman and theirs as a white woman, Harper noted the double burdens of racism and sexism for black women. And she said, "You white women here speak of rights. I speak of wrongs. I, as a colored woman, have had in this country an education which has made me feel as if I were in the situation of Ishmael, my hand against every man and every man's hand against me." So in order for them to form a true alliance, she explained, white women must understand the nature of black women's oppression and agreed to their equal inclusion in all of these reform endeavors and organizations, all right? So I think it's telling that Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton chose not to transcribe Harper's speech in their 1881 History of Women's Suffrage that gave a supposedly complete record of these convention proceedings with almost all the other speeches given in full. Harper's willingness to hold white women responsible for their role in racism seems to have made these leading white suffragists too uncomfortable. So they seem to have decided to decline to immortalize her words. Fortunately, they were recorded elsewhere. As I mentioned, this 1866 Women's Rights Convention had led to the formation of the American Equal Rights Association, which was dedicated, as its members said, to, quote, including both classes of disenfranchised citizens in politics and government. And so this is, of course, when they are talking about that, the both classes are blacks and women, right? So this is a moment when, if history had played itself out in a different way, I could have said, and then the Republican Party, triumphant after the Civil War, passed the amendment to the Constitution granting voting rights to all American adults, male and female, black and white, and that is where we could have had the end of this story. But that is not what actually happened. And so I guess I want to ask the question about what happened to this idea of universal suffrage. The activists were pretty sure that it was going to happen, and it got derailed. And so I want to talk a little bit about where that went. And basically, during Reconstruction, you have to remember that the Republican Party could have done it because it had control of Congress, the presidency. They could pass whatever laws were necessary to rebuild the country. The Democratic Party, of course, was not in power because the Southern Democrats were the ones who had seceded from the Union and started the Civil War. So they were not in a position to be in that first Congress after Reconstruction. Yet, during Reconstruction, the Republican Party, it turns out, was both timid and calculating. On the one hand, members of Congress started to worry about whether it would be too hard to give the vote to both black men and all women at once. They got cold feet, in particular, after they saw the results of an 1867 state-level referendum in Kansas, which showed the limits of white men's support for giving others the full citizenship rights they already enjoyed. In the Kansas vote, white male voters rejected giving the ballot to both blacks and white women. In response, the National Republican Party and even many members of the Equal Rights Association, including Frederick Douglass, started to talk about the need for this to be the Negro's hour, by which they really meant the Negro man's hour, right? And they argued that it would be safer and easier to concentrate on just gaining black men the right to vote. But I guess I want to pause here and ask a question, and that is, why do you think that Republican Party officials were more eager to give black men the right to vote than to give black and women the right to vote too, especially in the South? What's the strategic value of giving just black men the right to vote from the point of view of a Republican Party official?
I mean, part of it is that they could win elections in the South.
Okay, exactly. Because what would happen if you added women in?
Well, then you get all these white, Southern, white supremacists.
Right, so they're not going to
Democratic
vote for the Republicans, right? They'll vote for the Democrats. That's the party that they grew up with and that they supported in the Confederacy. So how do you ensure that every person who votes is going to vote for you? Well, you only enfranchise those people who will be guaranteed to vote for you. And because the Democratic Party, after the Civil War, I swear, had a slogan, the party of white supremacy, no black person in his right mind, or hers if she had been allowed, would have voted for that party, right? So the Republicans were fairly secure in their thought that they would be the party that would gain the votes of black males, okay? So that is why they decided to limit and eliminate white women from the possibility of having these voting rights. Okay? So basically, with this political calculation, the party decided to abandon universal suffrage and to promote black male suffrage instead. So this is a moment to look at the 14th Amendment a little bit more carefully. Now, in the context of our discussion, what I want to look at is what is the most interesting and new thing about this amendment from our perspective of women's voting rights. So there's lots of interesting things about the 14th Amendment, but from the point of view of women's voting rights, what's particularly interesting here? If you were a woman in the 1860s, what would you focus on?
Citizenship.
Well, in section 1, I mean, one of the requirements to vote is being a citizen. They're saying all persons born or naturalized are citizens. So if a woman's like, well, that says I'm a citizen, therefore I should be able to have the right to vote.
Exactly. So one really great thing is, to be honest, there was some doubt about whether women were full citizens, right? Especially with the married women and the whole coverture idea. This really clarifies it and says all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. are citizens. Okay, great. So women are citizens, and if you're an immigrant and your child is born here, that child is a citizen. That's where that comes from. This is a really important part of this amendment. Is there anything else, though, that you might notice?
Yeah, section 2, male inhabitants.
Okay, that's pretty bad. And actually, this is crucial. Male, it's the first time the word male has ever entered into the Constitution is right here. So the original Constitution doesn't have any gender-specific language like this, okay? The rest of the Constitution has all that stuff. People, we the people, our, persons. It's very, very generic. This is a problem. And the women in the Equal Rights Association, they see this as a problem, right? They can identify right away, we have a definition of voters, that adds the word male. That's where the Republican Party stuck it in, right? Is right there. So this is really problematic. A lot of historians argue that before the 14th Amendment, and more specifically right after the end of the Revolution when the Constitution was first passed and ratified, if other states had just gone ahead and given women the right to vote, there would not have been a need for a separate amendment giving women the right to vote. And the proof of this is that there was flexibility in the Constitution from the beginning. It didn't deny women the right to vote, and there was one state that gave women the right to vote for a little while, right after the Revolution. Does anybody know what it was?
New Jersey.
You got it. So New Jersey, a very progressive place. Anyone here from New Jersey? Okay. So for a few years, your state was doing very well. From 1776 to 1807, married property-owning women, could vote. So if you were a property owner, which usually meant actually you were widowed or single, you could vote in New Jersey. Until women provided the margin of victory from one party over another in a close election, otherwise known as the gender gap, at which point the guys decided to forget it. So they took women's voting rights out of the Constitution at that point. But historians argue that if more states had followed New Jersey's lead, that might not have ever been the issue that it became, and we wouldn't have had a history of women's suffrage.
Doesn't Kentucky allow widowed women, property owners, the right to vote as well?
At the time of
At the time it becomes a state.
I was going to say it doesn't really apply to the American Revolution time period, but yeah, I see your point.
As another.
Yeah, so exactly. Yeah.
Wouldn't you argue that the Equal Protection Clause forces states to give women the right to vote?
Well, okay, so we'll talk about that in a minute because this is exactly part of what comes up is this issue of how to interpret this amendment, right? And but what I want to do first, though, is I want to go back to this American Equal Rights Association, and it only existed for 3 years, and it broke up over this, right? This is the problem: is the 14th and 15th Amendments and this word male, etc. But basically, until the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, its highest priority of this American Equal Rights Association was actually to get the word male out. So they were in agreement, let's try to get it out. But once it was passed and it included the word male, then members started to argue about whether they should somehow support the final passage. I mean, once Congress passed it and went back out to the states for ratification, some American Equal Rights members said, well, why don't we not support the 14th Amendment because of this, right? And that became a little more contentious. And in the end, most of them did support the 14th Amendment as it was written. But then we get into another debate, and this comes up in the 15th Amendment, where the issue really gets highlighted. And in the 15th Amendment, this was another way to reinforce black male voting rights because they were already being threatened through terrorism, basically, and various kinds of violence at the polls. The Mississippi shotgun policy actually involved bringing cannons and guns to the polling places and loading the cannons with rocks and nails and things like that, and when blacks would come up to vote, shooting at them. So that was pretty dramatic and difficult. And so in this context, a 15th Amendment was needed to reiterate what the 14th Amendment already said. So you don't really need a 15th Amendment, right? It's already there. But just on the off chance that anyone missed it, let's try it again, right? So they have this 15th Amendment. But the 15th Amendment is fairly straightforward. But what is it missing, again, from the point of view of women's voting rights? Yes, sex is not included in the list, right? That's what it would have said. They wouldn't have said gender at the time, but they might have said sex, but they did not. They said the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, right? So women who were activists and who had been working for universal suffrage, this was like the final outrage, right? Like really unacceptable language here. And they felt very strongly about it. In fact, Elizabeth Cady Stanton felt so unhappy about it that in 1869, she wrote an article asking reformers to work against the 15th Amendment. Now, this suggestion upset other abolitionists who felt that it was sabotaging black men's chances at becoming full citizens. So this is the split and the reason why this group doesn't last. But I want to highlight what happened at the meeting when they actually dissolved. And this disagreement dominated the annual meeting of the American Equal Rights Association in 1869. And it was so fierce that it split the women's rights and reform community apart for many, many decades. On one side stood supporters of Anthony and Stanton, and on the other side stood supporters of Lucy Stone and there's Lucy Stone and there's Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass declared at this convention, quote, "I do not see how anyone can pretend that there is the same urgency in giving the ballot to woman as to the Negro. With us, the matter is a question of life and death. When women, because they are women, are hunted down through cities and hung upon lampposts, then they will have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own." Okay. That's a pretty powerful statement. Susan B. Anthony stood up and she replied, "The question of whether women should be enfranchised first or last should not even be debated. But if you will not give the whole loaf of justice to the entire people, then give it first to the most intelligent and educated women." Okay? So Anthony's suggestion that only literate men and women be given the right to vote was obviously a jab at granting voting rights first to former slaves, most of whom were illiterate because learning to read and write had been forbidden in southern states. And this is right afterwards, so you should what she was saying. Well, Frances Harper was there too. So she heard the racist rhetoric of Elizabeth Cady Stanton in particular, who negatively compared the rights of Sambo to those of white women. And in that context, Frances Harper rose to speak, noting that in Boston, 60 white women had recently walked off their jobs in protest of the hiring of one black woman who simply wanted, in her words, to gain a livelihood in their midst. She charged that white women had not united with black women, not even on the most fundamental issues of economic equality and self-support, the things that she had asked for 3 years before, right? Thus, she decided to join Frederick Douglass in supporting the 15th Amendment. And what she said at the convention was, if the nation could only handle one question, I would not have the black woman put a single straw in the way, if only the men of the race could obtain what they wanted. So Harper's support of black men's right to vote should not be mistaken as a lack of support for women's suffrage. She accepted the 15th Amendment's enfranchisement of black males and supported the launching of an immediate separate campaign for women's suffrage. Black women's suffrage strategies basically combined demands for their own right to vote and demands for the civil right and enforcement and protection of black men's voting rights and beings, right, in many different ways. So after this very heated debate, which as you can imagine, I always say that little tea party that you're gonna see obviously did not happen after the Civil War. So they had their tea before. But my story is a little more cynical than the one you're gonna get at the Evans house. But you just have to remember, it's pre-Civil War, after Civil War.
Aren't they missing the whole point with the section 2 there, with legislature can pass all the laws for enforcement? Isn't that what the Supreme Court should read these days?
Yeah, we'll have to talk about that. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Lucy Stone, where was she?
Oh yeah, we're getting to that. So I'm going to talk about the two different groups that form after the Civil War. And basically, not after this, it is after the Civil War, but more specifically after this event. So basically, Anthony and Stanton and their supporters left the association, which obviously collapsed, and formed a new organization which they called the National Women's Suffrage Association. And then basically what they wanted to do is focus on getting women the right to vote at the national level through another constitutional amendment. And they actually actively opposed ratifying the 15th Amendment because it blatantly discriminated against women. So obviously Harper could not join the National Women's Suffrage Association. And then you asked about Lucy Stone. Well, she created the other organization with Frederick Douglass, Henry Blackwell, and their supporters. And that other organization has the other very creative name of American Women's Suffrage Association. So one's the national, one's the American. And basically the American Women's Suffrage Association accepted the need for black male suffrage to come first. So they were going to support the 14th and 15th Amendments, but it was really the 15th that was at issue at that point. So they're going to accept those amendments and then work. But they're also thinking that they want to work state by state to get the right to vote rather than for a federal constitutional amendment first. It's a question of strategy. Later, when Frances Harper spoke at the 1873 American Women's Suffrage Association, which she had joined, she claimed that, quote, much as white women need the ballot, as much as white women need the ballot, colored women need it more, as an issue of basic survival. So even in this new organization, she was constantly trying to raise the issue of black men's and women's need for the ballot as a question of survival and safety in a way that no whites really had to confront. But basically, what I wanted to do is turn to that 14th Amendment again and talk about a strategy of the National Women's Suffrage Association, the one run by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. That National Women's Suffrage Association had the first attempt of how they were going to handle the situation of the 15th Amendment and the 14th Amendment is they created something that they called the New Departure. And the New Departure was basically going to pretend like this did not exist, right? They're going to ignore Section 2 and that word male because it's inconvenient and certainly doesn't help their cause. So they're just going to look at the Section 1, okay? And the New Departure is they just read that, like some of you did. Okay, look, we can vote. We're citizens. So as you'll hear, and I'm sure you've already heard before, they decided that women all over the country is a New Departure strategy. Black and white women all across the country would just march in to voting booths and registration areas all across the country and demand that they had the right to vote. They would carry in Section 1, we probably didn't bother writing down the second section, and just showing it to the officials, right? And in some cases, the officials were so startled by this approach that they actually let them vote. Sometimes they refused to give them the right to vote. Sometimes they voted and then arrested them and put them on trial. That's what happens to Susan B. Anthony, as you know. And she was very interested in trying to make the most of that event. And this is happening all through the very late 60s, right after this convention, through into the early 70s. This is what they're doing. So the example here in Rochester is that more than 50 women attempted to vote in the 1872 national congressional elections. And Susan B. Anthony was one of those women who was arrested and put on trial. And she was arrested at her house, and so you'll be there and can see where she was arrested. And she argued that here she was being tried by a prosecutor, a judge, and a jury of all white men, and that really nobody was a jury of her peers. She had no peers there, and that was the case for all other American women. But ignoring her arguments, the judge at the Canandaigua courthouse, which was kind of on the way to Seneca Falls, it's over there near one of those Finger Lakes, but in any case, the judge openly ordered the jury to find her guilty, which is really not what the judge is supposed to do, but he did, and they did, surprisingly enough. So Anthony had hoped to take the case up through the court system to the Supreme Court, of course, and the judge knew that full well. So when she refused to pay her fine, hoping that it would start a process, he said, okay, that's all right, and he refused to give her any punishment or penalty for refusing to pay the fine. So it stopped her case, and another person had to take the case forward, right? But so it was a little game that they were playing. So she didn't get to be the one to represent this issue in court. Yeah.
This is a simple question, but how did she vote? Not only what did she vote for, but really she was progressed in the Australian ballot. And this is before that. Would she give her vote orally? Is it a paper ballot?
No, it is a paper ballot, but they had it. If I am correct about the timing of this, it was basically you had to pick your party's ballot, and they were designated differently by I don't know if it's color, but some kind of super obvious coding, which was for blacks during the period of Reconstruction in the South with white officials, who ended up kind of. It became really dangerous because it was not a secret ballot process. So you would have had a paper ballot, and I own a women's ballots box, one of those boxes, and I always wonder, why did they have a separate box for women voters? Were they just going to dump them right after? It just strikes me as a little odd. But they did have them segregated, but that's of course once women get the right to vote. At this point, there's no such thing. So they're just getting the Republican ticket in effect, right? But yeah, so and they may have more information on that at the Susan B. Anthony house because I'm sure they know that whole story.
I'm thinking very cynically from the part of people running the voting, but why did they just take her ballot and throw it away? Because I just didn't want to make this a bigger issue, and what they did, they kind of did make it a bigger issue.
Right. Well, actually, in Rochester, you never know. It could be that the people who arrested her were sympathetic to her and wanted to help her get the case to court. That sometimes happens. And so a lot of times you have a kind of mutual agreement that, this is something that we're going to do. It happens with Plessy versus Ferguson, too. They weren't necessarily sympathetic, but they worked together to bring that case over segregation of the railroad cars together. But yeah, so you have this situation where that particular case doesn't really get solved with Susan B. Anthony. It gets resolved, sorry, I don't have it here. It's an 1875 case, and it's called Minor v. Happersett, M-I-N-O-R v. Happersett, H-A-P-P-E-R-S-E-T-T. And this is an 1875, Minor versus Happersett, is the case that the Supreme Court heard on this new departure strategy, looking only at the first part of the 14th Amendment. And the case considered, the court considered the case of Virginia Minor, M-I-N-O-R, who was a Missouri suffragist who, with her husband, had sued the official who had not allowed her to vote. Now, her husband sued too, because of course she was a married woman, so to be sure of her legal standing, they both sued, because he needed to have his consent, basically. In its ruling, the Supreme Court forcefully denied that there was any direct connection between citizenship and voting. Okay? So they said, yes, according to that 14th Amendment, Virginia Minor is a citizen. However, citizens do not automatically have the right to vote. Voting is a privilege that's granted by the federal government to the states to decide who could do it, unless there's an amendment, of course, that specifically says something like black men have to be one of those groups you let to vote, right? But unless it says, then the states get to decide. So what happened with that is, if voting is only a political privilege and not a civil right, then it showed that the Supreme Court was not interested in interpreting the new 14th and 15th Amendments in a broad or expansive way, right? They were not interested in trying to see, could this apply to women? Absolutely not. They just said, no, voting is a privilege, not a right. Okay? But then there's another case from about the same time as Minor versus Happersett that really shows that the U.S. Supreme Court was determined, in fact, to interpret the 14th Amendment as narrowly as possible. And this case was brought by another married woman named Myra Bradwell, and she sued to be able to practice law in the state of Illinois on the grounds that the 14th Amendment gave her liberty as a person and a citizen to pursue her profession and to be granted a license to practice law once she passed all the criteria that men had to pass. However, she was a married woman, okay? And so this is what the issue was. Illinois said if you were a married woman, you could not be a lawyer. So what does the court say? This is the U.S. Supreme Court unanimous decision. What's striking about the language here? Anybody have any point that you could pick out here that's at all interesting or problematic?
Man is woman's protector.
Okay. Anything else? What's striking to you about this?
The timidity and delicacy which belongs to female sex evidently unfits it for many occupations of life.
Okay, so first of all, it's really mobilizing every gender stereotype you can imagine, right? In a Supreme Court decision. Anything else that's interesting? Usually Supreme Court decisions are based on the other constitutional precedents.
Law of the creator. It doesn't say the Constitution.
Right, it's not looking back to the Constitution, it's talking about divine law. So, if you're a woman, you're going to have a pretty hard time with the Supreme Court because that's not how they're thinking about things, right? They basically say common law rules that woman doesn't have a separate legal existence. That's been the law of the land since the beginning. What are you talking about? This woman is a citizen, but it doesn't mean she can practice the law when she's married. And it's not saying she can't practice law. You clear on that? It's just saying that Illinois can make a law banning married women from this job, right? So of course, in other states, married women could be lawyers. It's just that this makes it clear that it can be the discretion of the states. Okay? So this ends the new departure. These two rulings, Minor v. Happersett and Bradwell v. Illinois, basically closed down the idea that you can use the 14th Amendment to really claim full citizenship rights. It's not working. So they have to have a different strategy. They stop trying to vote because that gets basically squelched by the courts very clearly with that Minor v. Happersett. So at that point, they turn back to the notion that you have to lobby for a constitutional amendment that would guarantee American women's voting rights. So they're focusing on what at the time would have been a 16th Amendment, right? That's what they want. It doesn't take them such a short amount of time, and it takes several amendments later, before they actually get this thing. But that's what they're hoping for. Now, in the meantime, Lucy Stone's American Women's Suffrage Association was focusing on trying to get women the right to vote in national elections, but through doing it on a state-by-state basis. So they also tried to pass laws at state and local levels that were designed to give women the right to vote in more limited contexts, as like sometimes they call it a wedge strategy, right? Like you get in on a little thing and then you hope to open it up. So the idea that they had is that women, because of all those gender stereotypes that you saw in the decision from the Supreme Court on the Bradwell v. Illinois, they thought, okay, women should be allowed to vote in school elections because they're mothers and they care about their children and they need to be paying attention to school politics, etc. And temperance, right? Because, of course, women were the primary victims of, at the time, mostly male alcoholism, which was related to the, incredible saloon culture, etc. But one of the things that happened is that women's livelihoods in their homes was diminished and endangered by men's drinking away their paychecks at saloons. And then, of course, domestic violence increased. So the idea was women should be allowed to vote in anything that had to do with liquor licensing, any kind of dry laws, that kind of thing. That would be the place for women to vote. So the American Women's Suffrage Association accepted all of that. However, neither strategy after this initial, new departure strategy, which seemed promising for a tiny bit of time, nothing was really working. And to prove this, I would point out that by 1890, Wyoming was the only state where women had full voting rights. Period. That's 1890. So the split in the women's rights community was obviously not helping the cause. And at that point, the women decided that they would have to come back together to try to win the right to vote without two separate organizations. So in 1890, the two main suffrage groups decided to unite into one potentially stronger group. And they unfortunately decided to call this the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NAWSA, which unfortunately they referred to as NASA, which I think is quite objectionable. But if you listen to documentaries on it, it's like NASA this, NASA that. It sounds terrible. But in any case, the National American Women's Suffrage Association basically agreed that full voting rights at the national level through a constitutional amendment was going to be the ultimate goal. But members did differ on how to achieve that. So some focused on the national amendment and fighting for it, campaigning for that. But some said, well, we need to increase the necessary number of representatives in Congress who would be willing to pass a national women's suffrage amendment, so we better work state by state still. So they still didn't really know, quite how to mobilize this. And then if you get back to thinking about where black women like Frances Harper were, they were members of NASA, but they also had to work for the right to vote separately because they were not fully accepted by these white suffragists. In the 1890s, members of a new group called themselves the National Association of Colored Women, NACW, and Frances Harper was its first vice president, and its first president was Mary Church Terrell. And they campaigned for voting rights for all women and for black men. And basically, they pointed out that black men had gained the right to vote, but then almost immediately lost that right through all of the violent intimidation that was happening throughout the South. So black women knew that their progress for their race was actually tied to enforcing fair and full citizenship and voting rights for everyone, right? They weren't going to say just for us. They had to include the men because the men weren't really all, fully enfranchised, even though technically they weren't, right? So they did not get the full support from white women, and so they decided, even though they would work with white women when they could, they needed their own organization. The National Association of Colored Women's Clubs was not only designed to fight for suffrage, but it always did fight for suffrage, right? So it had multiple goals. What is the process of getting a new constitutional amendment? It's very difficult. Does anybody know how you get a new constitutional amendment? Yeah.
Well, there's two ways of doing it. All amendments have done it one way. You have to get
Exactly. Let's talk about the
2/3
one
of the
way.
House, 2/3 of the Senate, or 2/3 of Congress will say.
Yeah.
Then it has to go to 3/4 of the states.
Okay, correct. Yeah, there is another way that the states
Yeah,
generate,
every
but it's never
single one
happened.
has done it
Exactly,
the same
so
way.
we're gonna do it this way. Well, we'll focus on that, I agree with you. You have 2/3 of the members of both houses of Congress have to pass it, and then it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures before the Constitution can be changed. Of course, that's why we have the world's oldest living Constitution, because it's flexible enough to be changed, but difficult enough that you can't change it on every whim. So this is actually a positive thing. It does pose a problem, though, for these women who are trying to make this change. And basically, the newly unified National American Women's Suffrage Association was hoping that these state-level campaigns would lead to more congressional representatives who would be voted in by the women voters of their states. And so then those representatives, women hoped, would vote for national constitutional amendment for women's suffrage because they were afraid of their own female voters, right, back in their own states. But this state-by-state strategy was very, very slow. In many states, suffragists mounted very expensive and time-consuming campaigns year after year, only to see them fail. So in spite of all of these efforts and this unified group, by 1913, right before World War I started in Europe, women had only won full voting rights in 9 states, okay? This is excruciating, right? By 1913, women had only won full voting rights in 9 states. So the leader of the National Association, NASA, was Carrie Chapman Catt. And she decided to try to improve their numbers by conducting massive lobbying efforts to gain, in this case, right around the time of when Woodrow Wilson was president, he became the first Democratic president after the Civil War. And basically, they were trying to get the Democrats, because they controlled Congress and the presidency at that point during Wilson's administration, to support women's suffrage. And women came from all over the nation in teams to the US Capitol to basically try lobbying Congress to pass a constitutional amendment. And so that is one way to do it. But the other way to do it was a way that was come up with, actually originally through a subsidiary group, a kind of affiliate group of NASA, but then they branched off on their own. They were called the Congressional Union, but eventually the National Women's Party. Has anybody seen Iron-Jawed Angels? Okay, that's actually a very accurate, historically accurate and really good film that it's called Iron-Jawed Angels. Right, yeah, it's an HBO production. It's very long, but parts of it, you can do like the last half of it, or last 2, even shorter, but just like some part at the end, and it's very worth showing. Because basically, what it does is it talks about this new group of women who are inspired by, they're slightly younger, they're inspired by protesters in England, the suffragettes. Suffragists here, suffragettes there. The suffragettes were absolutely and definitively more militant than any of the suffragists here. There, they were chaining themselves to the House of Parliament, the gates. They were blowing up mailboxes, engaging in a tiny bit of domestic terrorism, and then they were being sent to jail they didn't kill or hurt anybody, but they're just trying to make a point, right? but they did get a lot of publicity because they were jailed as basically political prisoners, went on hunger strikes, and were force-fed. Well, a new generation of young college women who were going, to Europe to study and to visit, including Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, who had been trained in American all-women's colleges like Vassar and Swarthmore, visited London, saw the protests, and were inspired to try to bring some of it back to the US in a more modified form. So what they took away was that the suffrage campaign had been basically stalled since, you can pick your date, right? Since the split in 1869, since something right after the Civil War. And it was many, many decades, and nothing had been changed. And they really appreciated the level of media attention that the suffragettes were achieving in England. And they decided to up the ante by trying to create, first, just a very dramatic parade through the streets of Washington, D.C., but timed to happen the day before President Wilson's inauguration. So every world press, all the reporters across the nation had gathered. There were huge crowds of people, and the whole point was, they're all going to be wearing white. They're all going to be kind of coming in on their floats and on led by Inez Mulholland on a white horse, etc. And unfortunately, Alice Paul is not all that different from Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. So she asks Ida B. Wells if she would march at the back because she doesn't want black women to be marching in the middle because she wants white Southern women to be able to feel comfortable. And so the black women who marched had to decide how to handle it. As far as we can tell, what they decided to do was try to kind of march in with their delegations. Like Ida B. Wells marched with the Illinois delegation. So she had been a strong anti-lynching advocate, I assume you know. But here she was wanting to work for suffrage and was still getting the same kind of unequal treatment that we had seen, Frances Harper experiencing a little earlier, right? So in that context, though, the parade was a huge hit because, first of all, President Wilson got off of the train station thinking he'd be greeted by thousands of people, and there was absolutely no one in Union Station. And he was like, where is everyone? Well, they're all at the suffrage parade. And there was violence against the women activists, which they turned to their advantage because, of course, there was lots of press coverage of the violence against these women. So for them, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing because they wanted the attention. Then they came up with the brilliant idea, and it was the first time that it had ever happened in American history, of picketing the White House. Up until 9/11, picketing the White House between 1913 and 9/11, picketing the White House was like a famous American tradition. Like that's what you do if you really want to make your cause, get awareness for your cause. You go stand out there. Now you can't get that close, and you certainly can't hang around with a sign. But nonetheless, this is the way that they handled it. And they stood silently with signs. Once World War I started, the signs actually had the words from Wilson's speeches about making the world safer for democracy. And they would just pull him back to himself, trying to make the point that obviously the world was not particularly safe for democracy if half of all Americans could not vote. So, although they were very non-disruptive, they were arrested for blocking the sidewalk, and because that's a serious offense, they would get 6 to 9 months in prison. And they decided that the way to handle this was to emphasize that they were political prisoners because it's a ridiculous amount of jail time for this kind of a situation. And so they went on hunger strikes in the prison. And there were working class women, there were immigrant women, and there were very wealthy women, all of whom participated in these protests. And Mary Church Terrell, who was the first president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, she had ticketed, she didn't happen to get arrested, so she was not one of the prisoners. But so lots of women of all different kind of races and ages and classes, were participating, but the press focused on the wealthy women. And especially on the fact that members of the president's cabinet had their daughters and wives in prison, that there were people who were of kind of high value, like people in there, and they were wasting away from these hunger strikes. So then they were force-fed, and the outrage about women being force-fed in prison for having done this was kind of huge, right? So this is all happening at a point when you have the First World War going on. And Wilson says, I refuse to talk about this, I refuse to endorse women's suffrage because it's not a war issue. And I'm only going to support things that are connected to the war. And women kept saying, oh, well, so Carrie Chapman Catt disavowed all of this, said this was disloyal, unpatriotic, horrible, and went about doing the lobbying. And her argument was, we want you to bring this as a war issue, and the way you can is to point out that we've been all the war workers. Not only are we doing the volunteering and the nursing that we've done in every war, now we're in the munitions plants and we're building all of the bombs and doing all of the work to make this war happen. So in the end, President Wilson does bring it in as a war, like under the idea that it's an issue of war. And this is the 19th Amendment that gets passed and then finally ratified in 1920. And I guess what I want to talk about and have you think about is this question of whether you think, drawing on not just this, but presumably other things you've seen, or if you've watched this movie or you've read other things, do you think that the more militant protests were more successful, the lobbying? Was it a combination of both? How important was the state-by-state effort? All of these things, I'm just wondering how you would think about how finally does this thing really happen, right? It finally happens in 1920. They started talking about it before the Civil War, but really, gained some traction in terms of women's activism after the Civil War. What do you think?
I think when you mentioned at the end, we kind of talked around about this. Joe's brought up this point. You have this movement led by, particularly in the women's movement, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Dixon, at least early on, who are very either at least middle class or more well-to-do in society, and they can't seem to get, traction, at least at a localized level, where you have the national things like that, but then you said, over those years they're only getting 9 states better. And now it seems like they're getting more of those kind of individual people involved, like you mentioned that, there's immigrant women in there, there's working class women that are in jail, not eating next to, the sons or the daughters of cabinet members.
Mm-hmm.
So it looks like it's at least getting more traction with the more multitude of women that are becoming involved.
Okay, that's an excellent point. The movement does broaden over time, and more women of all different classes. We already have said that women of various races have been supportive of women's voting rights, so that's already there. But the class issue, definitely working class women start to see the issue. And in the Iron Jawed Angels, they kind of simplify it, but it works. And what it did happen at the time, one of the things that the women would say when they were going out trying to get other working class women to support it, they were saying, we've had these horrible fires, like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911. We need to be able to have the right to vote to be able to demand fire escapes. And, so the way they do it in the movie is some kind of thing like, a vote is a fire escape, but it's really true. It's how do you connect this to an issue that a lot of women, especially in this case, working women, care about. Okay, protection laws that are gonna make the workplace safer. You know, those kinds of progressive era regulations are gonna be a big way to move women into support of women's suffrage. That's one thing.
I always wondered how much Wilson brought to the table because he wanted to be part of the peace process overseas, and this was an embarrassment to him. Here you have all these women, you know, this big inherent democracy, and he's got this. He's got his 14 points, and he wants to put forward and sort of lead Europe in its old age. And he's got this big problem, and he's already working on all that to send it over there. So let's put this to bed, so I don't look, you know, so people can take me seriously.
Oh, absolutely, because the timing of it is that this is all happening in 1919 when he's trying to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles and running into all these various problems. And yes, it looked terrible. And of course, the women who did this knew exactly that. And you know, not only did they have the signs with his words on it, they ended up doing something they called watchfires for freedom. And in Lafayette Park across the street, they took these big kind of urns, and they would read his speeches on democracy and burn them and throw them into the little urns, you know, which also got them arrested, as you can imagine. And that was a bigger charge because then they were making fires. But you know, but nonetheless, the point was that yes, this was highly embarrassing, and they even had banners that they would create, like when the Russian, you know, ambassador would come, like, you know, Russian ambassador, you think you have problems, what about women? You know, so they really did try to highlight it at an international level, and then wanted to.
Yeah, related, what about the Red Scares, the Russian Revolution? I'm just thinking of the civil rights in the world of the Cold War and pushing civil rights legislation. To what extent did that?
Well, Cold War is after the Second World War,
No,
so
I
that's
mean,
not.
Red Square, I mean, the Russian
The first
Revolution.
Red Scare, yes, I mean, no, eventually it becomes the Cold War, but at this point, you know, the way that the US government responded to a fear of subversives in World War I does not necessarily help women activists, because they pass the Sedition and Espionage Acts, which basically limit speech and consider more speech to be subversive, right? So it's a hard time to be an activist, as it is after World War II, for the same reason, because you know, you're kind of associated with subversive behavior. And it was particularly bad for union members or people on the left labor movement. And they didn't target as many African Americans over civil rights issues as they did after World War II. After World War II, black activists who were civil rights activists were always charged with being communists. And, you know, so it's just like, what's an easy way to squelch this? But that's not exactly the same in that first situation. But so I would say that doesn't really help their cause, right? But it makes it more complicated to win. And so that's why it's also interesting that they did. Did you ever
I think that the impact of the world stage, just like the Kennedy and civil rights movement was, you know, we want to take care of this business, but I think that there was a class issue. Norton Prison in Virginia, which used to be part of the DC corrections, they kind of rented it out. Then they got out of it and they reopened it to show that it was a women's prison, the forced feeding and whatever that happened in that prison. But they mostly, in terms of that display, show the middle class women. They really didn't acknowledge, it didn't get the attention that the middle class women did in terms of these bad things happening. So it wasn't so much as the others don't think were unimportant, it's just that got everybody's attention more, because it was a little closer to home to the power base.
Right. And so the truth is, of course, putting a working class woman in a prison where you're forced to do labor, well, you know, but if you put in the senator's wife, you know, then yeah, it gets more attention, because those women are the ones who were idealized as these kind of ladies of leisure, you know, who were pure, the dewdrops, right, that Harper was making fun of. But you know, those dewdrops are now in prison being force fed. And so in that context, that is good publicity. So, you know, you have to give them credit for being pretty smart about that, yeah.
Was there any backlash of women voting? I mean, it seems so odd to me that African American men got the vote so much earlier and had years of just struggling to actually
over 100 years, and then the women took so long to get their amendment, but then were they just like, oh, great, we have it, no backlash afterwards?
Backlash, what do you mean backlash?
Like, you know,
Jim Crow laws.
persecution of when they go to vote, people going against them.
Not white women.
Okay.
Black women do face exactly the same kinds of things. And so one of the things that black women do is they go back to Alice Paul, you know, after the National Women's Party, you know, in effect has helped achieve women's voting rights, and they say that her, okay, you're gonna, by 1923, she's created an Equal Rights Amendment and is gonna try to fight for that. And they say to her, can we specifically talk about enforcement of the voting rights and protection and federal enforcement? And she says, no, that's a race issue, and we're only doing, you know, questions of sex here. You know, so, and Mary Church Terrell was very upset because she had been working on her own organization, but always trying to keep a toe in, right? She stayed at Susan B. Anthony's house. She gave speeches for Susan B. Anthony. She was friendly with Alice Paul. She tried, but she never, you know, trusted them fully. But, you know, she just felt like you can't do this. Black women can't do it on their own. They have to work with white women, but the white women constantly disappointed, constantly. And that doesn't change, unfortunately.
I use a slightly different approach. I talk about the fact that they're going to give women the right to vote, but it's the wealthy white women that are going to vote, and you're going to use that to counter all the Catholics and immigrants that are coming in, and you need their vote now. So that's the reason that they're given vote. And in the South and a lot of other places, those poor whites, they vote just like poor blacks, and they don't have the right to vote. So there's a way of keeping them out. They need the vote, so they allow women to vote. It's what they do in Europe. Certainly, you make that argument as well.
Okay, I mean, I see your point, and I think in some ways it goes back to what Harper had said, and she predicted in 1866 when she said, you know, women are going to vote just like men do. There's going to be the good, the bad, and the indifferent, and you know, it's not going to be. But women truly believed, and a lot of men too, that women would change the world with their votes, and that they would vote completely differently from men. It turns out that your religion, your region, your class, all kinds of things make you vote a certain way. And if you're married to a Republican guy, he doesn't have to force you to become a Republican. You already think you want to be a Republican. You know, so it turns out that women, until more recently, actually weren't voting a gender gap. And they were voting like their, you know, people near them. And so that was kind of a disappointment for some people, but a big relief to most, you know, who didn't have to worry anymore about kind of courting white, especially white women's votes, right? Like, let's not worry about that anymore. So there was a bit of a transition, you know, when women got the right to vote. But I guess what I would point out when you say, is there a backlash? I wouldn't say there's a backlash, but there is a realization that voting rights are not enough. And what happens is that when women get the right to vote, they automatically see, oh, wow, it's much worse than I thought. I can vote, but I still can't be on a jury. Because each state got to, and county, whatever, got to make their own rules about juries. And in most places, they wouldn't let women serve. And so, or, you know, you had to be, like, men got automatically put on the list, and women had to go to the courthouse every year and reaffirm that they wanted to be on a jury, you know, or in a jury pool. So they're making it as hard as possible to do, or automatically exempting all married women with the notion that they have to be taking care of their kids, and that you only would have to appeal if you wanted to do it. So that's why Alice Paul came up with the Equal Rights Amendment idea, right? Is because then you could just in one fell swoop make it so that there's no laws that affect people differently. But to get back to this notion of how you explain what happened and what the balance of all these things are, I would say that between 1913 and 1920, when it's finally ratified, more and more states are coming on board with this more militant protesting, with the increase in lobbying, with the greater respect for women's war work, right, and their contributions, which would give them a kind of bigger claim to full citizenship and voting rights. So in that context, remember, New York was not super ahead of the curve. New York gave women the right to vote in 1917. So right at the very end, they got in before the federal amendment. But basically, you know, you could argue that people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and Frances Harper and Mary Church Terrell, who looked kind of radical because they were talking about women's equality and voting rights, in the context of Alice Paul and Lucy Burns and people going to jail and going on hunger strikes and being force-fed, those people look less radical, right? And so maybe you can deal with them. So that's what Carrie Chapman Catt and the NASA group, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, were always saying, right? Deal with us. You know, let's work on this and kind of marginalize these crazier people. Think about it in terms of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. They were considered to be communist wackos, right? Like the worst subversives in America. People thought they were crazy for trying to get integration. But then you get people in the mid-60s, like Malcolm X, calling whites the blue-eyed devils. Oh, what did they say? They just want to sit somewhere on the bus? Okay, fine, right? Because comparatively speaking, oh, those people look like moderates if you have people talking about blue-eyed devils. So, you know, sometimes there's something to be gained from having like a more radical side to make the people who before were on the far end seem a little bit more moderate, right? And then, you know, I don't know, last time you asked this question of like, well, how do you change patriarchy all of a sudden like that?
Well, that's what I was just thinking right now. I mean, you had a great slide.
Okay, oh yeah, my favorite slide.
You know, this is an amazing slide that I've actually stolen from Alison. I use it in class all the time when I teach this stuff.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
pretty phenomenal. It's actually a little earlier in time. We're going to jump back. Does anybody know who that woman is in the middle? It's a specific woman. Nope. It's actually Frances Willard. She was the head of the largest women's organization of the 19th century. Does anybody know who Frances Willard was?
She starts at women's school.
Nope.
Women's Christian Temperance.
That was Emma Willard.
Women's Christian Temperance.
Correct. Women's Christian Temperance Union, okay? The Women's Christian Temperance Union also helps really broaden the cause for women's suffrage because as you listen to the title, Women's Christian Temperance Union, they bring in effect, conservative Christian women who favor temperance, right, to the cause of suffrage by saying you're never going to stop the problem of drinking, right, in your family and with men, if you don't have the right to vote. So you have to have the right to vote. But she had a really interesting way of approaching it. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton scared people to death because they called themselves, they said women and men are created equal, right? Okay, that's very threatening. That really upsets the power structure and patriarchy. But she was brilliant. She came up with a strategy that allowed the Women's Christian Temperance Union to accept suffrage by 1881. That's pretty early for, you know, conservative white women. And what she said was it's the home protection ballot. Right? Pretty good, huh? I wish I could come up with something like that. It's a brilliant idea. You want the ballot not because you're demanding equality and you're challenging patriarchy and everything else, but because you simply need it to protect the home. So you have to leave the home and have the vote and be a full citizen in order to protect your home, right? So almost every woman can get on board with that. So it expands the movement dramatically. And it is not a coincidence that women's suffrage and temperance both become constitutional amendments, right, at the same time. I mean, it's 1 year apart. But men pass prohibition before they pass women's suffrage, and men do pass both, right? So they have been raised by women's suffrage activists who've been teaching them the temperance pledge, and they've been going to like temperance clubs, right, as little boys. And so by the time they're in the 20th century, they're ready to accept prohibition and women's suffrage. And, oh, but before we completely forget, who is this esteemed woman surrounded by?
The other.
What others?
Well,
Prisoners.
it's just like the Klan marching
Savages.
down Pennsylvania Avenue at this time. A lot of it has to do with the anti-immigrant.
Well, okay, but who are these people more specifically? I mean, they don't have names.
I mean, like you would have like the imbecile,
Yes.
criminal.
Right.
And of course, the Native Americans.
And these are all people who are disenfranchised, right?
Right.
Okay, so it's basically like the criminally insane, prisoners, you know, maybe idiots, you know, people who can't vote. And so the whole point of this is a kind of nativist, it ties in with Elizabeth Cady Stanton's Sambo thing, right? Like, and Susan B. Anthony's the most literate women, right? The most literate and educated women. How is it that this most literate and educated woman, who actually it was not Emma Willard, this is Frances Willard. Emma Willard had the school, but Frances Willard, she was the first dean of women at Northwestern University. And they created a dean and she was the first one, and then she became the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So she has an education connection. But yeah, so this is their poster trying to get women the right to vote, right? Pretty good propaganda, don't you think? So these are the kinds of things that are expanding the possibilities to make it more possible that from that Bradwell decision where the language is all so gendered, how is it possible that women get the right to vote even at all? It's from stuff like that. Does anybody have questions or comments about any of this?
I mean, I guess what you raised that just a moment ago, that when I used to teach this stuff more, and I was just do the first half, and I still do some of it, but what I always start with, is the gender question is the most dangerous revolution because it affects all men. And patriarchy is a system of power that exists, as far as we know, for time immemorial. There was, for a little while, the kind of fantasy of a women's society back in time at some point, but it's not clear that that's at all factual or historical. And so you have basically, up until at some point in the middle of the 19th century, societies that are founded on male power, on patriarchy as the structure. And then over a period of, let's say, from Mary Wollstonecraft to the right of women to vote, what is that, 100 years? A little bit over that. Wollstonecraft's late 18th century, so a little bit over 100 years. The whole system fractures. And so we tell narratives about how that happened, right? And we emphasize a lot of the times the roles of individuals like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And we emphasize legal, political, institutional changes, people getting out there and asking for the vote and lobbying. Is that enough? I'm amazed that over a very, a speck of dust in the context of human history, all of a sudden, the fundamental relationships, the building blocks of that social unit, the family structure, is fundamentally changed. My tendency, as I think we've talked about this before, the way I structure this workshop is that it's an interpretation, it's a thesis. And I always push for economic understandings, economic ideas, economic, understanding the world through work. And I guess one of the things I raised a couple of days ago was, let's look at those Seneca Falls women, right? And let's look at not Seneca Falls women meeting in the Methodist chapel, but the ones working in the glove factory outside. Are they transforming domestic, social, economic relationships such as this is a realignment of the changes they make? Or is the political to be emphasized over the sort of, economic and social relations of production? That's not a popular phrase anymore. It hasn't been for 40, 50 years in academic circles.
Yeah, but I see your point. And I think that it is true that if we talk about this from the 1820s forward, the reason why women were able to participate in so many more of these movements is a combination of expanding education, which is another piece of this, because women get education after the American Revolution, especially beyond the most elite, on the basis that we have these kind of common schools that even, like, all boys are probably going to be able to vote if they're white eventually, especially by the 1820s. And so therefore you need Republican motherhood, right? You need women to be educated enough to be able to train their sons to be good Republicans, lowercase, right? Members of the new republic. And so, you have this increase of education, and then also in the 1820s, you have this expansion of America's industrializing economy. And it's the textile factories and places like that where women are getting their first chance of real wage earning work at the working class level. Obviously, black women who are enslaved are being forced to labor throughout this whole period, and so their value of their work is not considered in the same category because it's not chosen at all. But on the other hand, with white women's labor, you see a continual increase, basically from the early 19th century all the way through. And World War I is certainly a period where it's not that more women work than ever before, although that's continually happening all the way through until today. But what happens in World War I is that there's a shift of women's work from like the lowest paid, least desirable jobs, and they shift from where they already were working into much better paid and respected war work, which are mostly like in much more highly skilled and trained factory environments. And so that shift does help in this argument that women are capable in all kinds of ways. And they also then have more power in their families if they're contributing to the income. So this question of patriarchy and the dominance in the family of the man does start to shift. And you can link it to a lot of different things. It's a complicated story. But I think
Civil War as well. I mean,
yeah.
the increase of women working during the Civil War in munitions itself. So I mean, I guess the idea, and I want to returning to this, but because there's a historiographical or interpretive framework issue that you in fact have all kinds of different levels of evidence and all kinds of different things, and depending on what you choose and what you ask and what you interpret, then you get a very different set of answers to the questions that you ask. And one of the things that I'm struggling with a lot is, and I was doodling about this the other day, is that in fact our own positions as educated, middle class, in many cases white, or in other cases black, academics seems to also load the cards, such that when the questions are asked, they're questions that are asked from a perspective we're very familiar with. So I do tend to think we privilege, for example, questions at law. Questions, our source base privileges those by virtue of the fact that we use written words as sources. And so the laws and books and ideas become, far more powerful than hammers and, no, I don't want to have sex with you today because I'm too tired, I've been working all day, get the hell out of my face, issues.
Well, I don't know, I guess what I would say.
Shifting relations of power within the bedroom. And I mean, this is what the Bobskis used to say in our classes, the women's revolution threatens men in the bedroom. It threatens them in the living room, in the kitchen. It threatens them in the workplace. It threatens them in Congress. So that's why it's so crazy and powerful and awesome, right?
Right, and then so we could add birth control, right? Because this is also the time period in the early 1900s when Emma Goldman and Margaret Sanger are trying to work on access to birth control, which is illegal in the United States at that time because of the Comstock Act of 1873. So there's all these pressures on people. I don't go for the economically based argument, as Joe knows, and partly that's because I would point out that all of the people who force Supreme Court decisions through that entire structure are actually often people who don't have a lot of needs. When Plessy decides to, not, basically to get arrested on the streetcar because of challenging racial discrimination, and he's not a wealthy person. He's doing this as an attempt with a bunch of other people to try to challenge these laws. And it does go through the system, but I put a lot of weight in the constitutional amendments, even though they aren't enforced and we see a lot of disappointing things going on. If you don't have them, you have nothing to base it off of. And so voting rights activists and everybody else, everybody needs to have these kind of high-level laws. They're not abstract and they're not inconsequential. And that's why the 1964 and 5 Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, which basically just affirm these amendments, were really important because it had to happen. And we're at another point where these kinds of questions about criminality, the law, and the place of the law, there's a lot of ways to talk about that, and the problems with mass incarceration and other problems that we're facing today, come out of that whole history, and it's going to be people are gonna do it through the Constitution and through taking legal action, as well as mass protests and the Black Lives Matter movement and all that stuff. It's gonna be a kind of combined effort, and I don't know that we can say it's only one or the other. It's.
No, you're right, and
together.
just, I'll go back to it in a second, but just this very morning, New York Times, one of the lead stories in it, or one of the upshot, I think it was, one of that section of the paper, they were talking about how in fact millennials, so-called millennials, have gender relations which are far in advance of the du jour legal relations or even the social relations of production that are common in their workplaces. So that in fact there's a kind of conflict that's developing because young men and women who are starting families have embraced a kind of egalitarian position, and that egalitarian position is sometimes incompatible with their work responsibilities and or their legal ability to balance those work responsibilities. So in effect, in this case, it seems that there's a kind of social cultural shift that's moving, not so much the economic developments. And so you're right, I think maybe, obviously you're right, there's numerous factors. We'll go there and then over here.
Well, I'm just going back to the education, that underlying basis. The Hartford Weekly, in a quote in the 1800s, around the Civil War, said that the way to keep people enslaved is to keep them from being able to read. And so then when you get into the 1900s and the need to be able to have literacy, to be able to support this war effort, now you have much more. I mean, the literacy rate in the U.S. was really low until after that time. And then you had this increase in literacy, which then means that you can read all of the stuff and you can conversation with people based on information that's being published and promoted and things like that. And I think that gives, a whole different source for the power base.
Mm-hmm. Right, and of course, you know that Frederick Douglass said the same thing. I mean, he basically said when he was punished for learning how to read and write, he realized that language was power and that it was being kept from blacks and maintained by whites. And so he's like, I'm going to learn how to do that because obviously that's the way out. And so, it's a very critical moment to kind of keep it in mind that blacks and women were fighting for all of these things, and they did have to take a multifaceted approach. And one argument, actually, that some suffrage activists said is that Anthony and Stanton were too narrowly focused on just suffrage, and that they, because they were trying to say, well, we're going to get distracted by all these other things. But there were so many other causes, including divorce reform, et cetera, all of which challenges patriarchy and moves things along, right? So, yeah, well, thank you.
Yeah, I'm just always curious about to what extent do conditions shape consciousness. That Upshot article is really interesting because you have these self-reports of millennials, especially young men who are very progressive compared to previous generations. And once they get into the workplace and the material conditions prohibit them or limit them from living the kind of life they want to, they shift, their attitudes shift, and they're more favorable to more traditional gender arrangements, male breadwinners and wives.
Yeah, that was the idea of the article, that there's increasing the attention
How to go read this thing. Yeah.
expectations and realities and hopes at some level. And what I find really fascinating, and maybe I see a kind of current happening with the New York Times, is that the people who comment on it are increasingly becoming shriller. And some of the comments were really shrill in the sense that they were sort of like, it's the law of the creator. This is a function of nature. Women get pregnant, they have to stay at home. They're not feeling well, they have to breastfeed. People make conscious choices to raise healthy children by breastfeeding, and so you're out a year and a half. The man is more entrenched in his workplace. All of a sudden, it's hard for him to quit. So there was this actual, really kind of weird reactionary sort of element in the comments, which I don't usually get in the New York Times, although increasingly I see a pattern. It's anecdotal. And so, that tension still exists. These guys were basically saying, and I think they were overwhelmingly guys, that it's a law of the creator. It's a function of nature that we have these gender relationships, and that's how it works out. There's an interesting experiment happening in Canada, in the sense that for about a long time now, at least 10, 15 years, or as long as we've had kids, the law has been that both men and women can take paternity leave, paternity leave? Parental, thank you. I'm just stuck in patriarchy. They take parental leave, and they both have the equal ability to do so. So the woman presumably takes the first year or whatever it is, and then the men take the, and it's paid by the employer. One of the things I've been thinking about is at some point, will that actually result in empirically ascertainable differences in terms of gender norms and ideas about gender norms? Presumably, this millennial upshot article wouldn't take place in Canada. Because in Canada, they both have the ability to do that, and lots of people do that. We have friends who, take a year off if they work for firms that have that kind of policy in place. So presumably, that's not going to change. But I think that the article is an interesting one in that it looks at material experience on the ground at the law firm, at the brokerage house, at the whatever, expectations and gender norms going into that material experience and what happens as a result of pregnancy and trying to raise children under these conditions.
So I'm gonna be
Yeah.
the
That's okay. Any last question before, one more, and then we'll.
It's not really a question, just I wonder, you talked about the shift from patriarchy in the last 100 years. So what do you think the next 100 years will bring? There's more women being educated and in the workplace. If you look around this room, there are more women here. So what will the United States look like in
Probably a
100 years from
matriarchy,
now?
I think, right? We're gonna go from patriarchy to matriarchy.
Yeah.
You could say as a function of teaching, that it's a female occupation.
But there are more women graduating from college
Yeah.
than ever
But
before.
that concept that they're saying that in education is to return to the days when it was a female, much more female.
Collar job. Hill for 2016. I think
Even
is
in
the-
university level, people are graduating from
I have a
college.
fun little thing to put out there. I don't know how many people have seen, but especially for those who teach world history, there is a new movie coming out in October on the suffragettes. And Meryl Streep's starring in it, so it's the British movement for women's rights that's coming out. So I don't know if they've released anything to academia yet,
I
but
think
it
so,
looks
ate my baby, is what she's gonna say.
No, that's great. Thank you for telling us that to be interesting. Well, thank you for.
Join me in thanking.
Thank you.